Hello, everybody. Why are people all over the world losing faith in democracy? This is the question that I'm going to answer today. I'm going to put up some slides for us to look at. Uh, First of all, is it true that people are losing faith in democracy? Here I have a quote from the Pew Research Center from a survey that was published a couple of years ago. And this is what this analysis found, is that there is definitely a loss of faith in democracy around the world. And we have seen increasingly over the last couple of years the use of terms such as democratic backsliding or even democratic recession to describe the situation in terms of the enthusiasm that people around the world feel towards democracy and democratic institutions. And what the Pew Research Center found was that one of the largest reasons for the dissatisfaction with democracy that keeps growing is that people around the world are losing faith in the capacity of the political elites or even any sort of willingness on the part of democratically elected representatives to do anything that the people who voted for them want them to do. So there's an enormous disconnect between what citizens of different countries want, the policies that they support, and what their elected representatives are actually willing to do or interested in doing. Yeah, so when I saw this statistic from the Pew Research Center, it immediately made me think of this very important quote from Dmitry Muratov, the Nobel Peace Prize winner in 2021, who was talking about this exact thing. He said, "Why did the world become disillusioned with democracy? The world has become disillusioned with the ruling elites. An illusion has appeared that progress can be achieved through technology and an application of force and not by defending human rights and liberties. This is progress without freedom." I think that this is a really good diagnosis of the situation that we're experiencing. It doesn't really explain the causes of this dissatisfaction with democracy, and I'm going to try to explain those causes right now, but it diagnoses the situation perfectly well. I want to look at different regions around the world briefly to see how things stand in terms of support for democracy. Here we can see, and this is again from a couple of years ago, the percentage of Latin Americans from different Latin American countries who believe that democracy is preferable to other forms of government. Of course, we see on the side that has the highest support for democracy, Venezuela. Obviously, this is a country that now is experiencing currently one of the very few remaining dictatorial regimes in Latin America. So Venezuela has a high support for democracy. But then let's look at the opposite side of the spectrum, and we can see Guatemala and El Salvador. Only 28% of people in these countries think that democracy is preferable to authoritarianism and dictatorship. Now, this is very disturbing because Guatemala and El Salvador are countries that they have democracy right now, and this democracy was very hard won. Guatemala experienced a 30-year-long civil war where a brutal military dictatorship was squashing every effort of Guatemalans to fight for representative democracy in their country. Finally, with the collapse of the USSR and the end of the Cold War, Guatemala managed to create a representative democracy in the early 1990s. But just within 30 years from that time, there was already such an enormous disillusionment with democracy in Guatemala. Again, El Salvador, a very similar situation where there was a long civil war, 12 years long. Again, people fighting for a chance to have a democracy in their country. Finally, democracy comes to El Salvador. El Salvador actually has a very interesting, dynamic democratic government right now. But still, the support for democracy in El Salvador is very, very low. It's clearly there's something that's not working. Even more disturbingly, here on the same side of the political spectrum, we see Mexico. Mexico is the oldest, the most stable democracy in Latin America. That Mexico is a country that has not experienced any dictatorships since 1910. And always such a great point of pride for Mexicans that they have a functioning democracy with all of the problems, obviously it has problems, but that they have a functioning democracy, that they have this stable, uninterrupted democratic rule. And now look at what's happening. Only 38% of people in Mexico believe that democracy works better than other forms of government. According to Latino Barometro, the overall support for democracy across Latin America is right now at the lowest level at only 48%. Interestingly, the people who are losing interest in democracy in Latin America are either the youngest generation or the wealthiest people. The youngest generation, we could say, well, that's because they personally have not experienced dictatorships, and so maybe do not have a memory of what a dictatorship is like, so they don't appreciate democracy very much. And the wealthiest Latin Americans, because the current state of affairs is good for them, it benefits them. Why would they need democracy? Why would they need to listen to anybody who does not belong to their social class? In just under a decade, the dissatisfaction with democracy in Latin America increased by 20%, went from 51 to 71%. And that is very troubling because that's a huge jump in a very short period of time. So there must be something that is causing this, right? There must be something that is going on that is creating this negative response even to just the word democracy. If we're talking about Latin America, this disillusionment with democracy is particularly disturbing. Why is this disturbing? Because Latin America experienced in the 20th century what is known as the golden age of dictatorships. And between the decades of 1970s and the collapse of the USSR, many Latin American countries experienced brutal, horrific dictatorships and often civil wars that would arise as a result of these dictatorships. So you would think that with the memory of the dictatorships being so recent, that people would have a higher appreciation for democracy, but apparently even that is not causing disillusionment with the idea of democracy to diminish in any way. So this is a really big question. Why did the enthusiasm for the democracies that were so hard won, that were so wanted, so desired for such a long time, why did that enthusiasm just evaporate so fast? Now, if we look at the entire Western Hemisphere, so now we want to include not only the countries of Latin America, but also Canada, the United States, we can see that the support for democracy across the entire Western Hemisphere has also been diminishing, maybe not as fast as just within Latin America, but support for democracy throughout the hemisphere has declined by almost 10 percentage points from 2004 to 2021. Also, this is quite disturbing. Let's look at the post-Soviet space. And this is also a good example because if we're talking about the post-Soviet space, we're talking about countries that experienced a totalitarian regime fairly recently, historically. And when the Soviet Union fell apart, there was an enormous enthusiasm in the post-Soviet space for democracy. There was an enormous sense of, well, finally we have achieved democracy, and this is a wonderful thing. But then we started seeing more and more in Russia specifically, reiterated statements that, well, democracy doesn't work for everybody. Maybe it's really not for us. Maybe that's not a really good thing. And again, this happened so fast. It was just barely a decade since the collapse of the USSR that we started seeing these kinds of statements come into Russia, and then they became more and more frequent. And today, as we know, Russia is existing in this authoritarian state that the people of Russia seem to find completely acceptable, and they are very happy about it. Then another example is Belarus, one of the former Soviet republics, now an independent country, has existed in a state of totalitarianism for over 2 decades right now, no movements towards democracy. In Ukraine, it took a while for Ukraine to start moving towards democracy. It was not until 2013, 2014, when we can speak about an actually successful attempt to bring democracy to Ukraine. So it's a slow, painful, uneven journey accompanied by a rise in illiberal authoritarian regimes. And by illiberal, I don't mean any kind of a political orientation of these regimes. I'm just using the word illiberal in the sense of anti-freedom. And a continued struggle to create functioning democracies. Again, with many people questioning, is democracy even something that we need at this point if it's so hard to put in place and the benefits of creating it are so uncertain? Well, people can ask, well, we're talking about countries where democracy is fresh. It's very young, Latin America, post-Soviet countries. Maybe that is the problem. Maybe we're talking about countries that are just not used to democracy, and that's why they're having a problem with it. Well, things are not great in old established democracies either. We're seeing throughout the countries of Western Europe, the United States, Canada, countries with a very well-developed democratic tradition, governments adopting increasingly illiberal measures. There's growing popular discontent, people coming out to protest by the thousand, by the million, and the governments are just indifferent. And for those of us who live in these countries, when we can think about a variety of policies that have enormous popular support, and there is no political power actively championing them or doing anything about those policies beyond just some talking points. So people feel that this is what we want, and there is nobody there to put in place what we demand. And the opposite is happening. Their policies are extraordinarily unpopular, according to every measure, bipartisan, total lack of support from the public, and yet those policies are being put in place, and this goes from one country to another. Here I put some images from the protests in France that have been going since 2018. Not that anybody seems to care much in France. We're not seeing much of the demands of the protesters being reflected in the actual policies of the French government. In Canada, in winter 2022, we saw massive protests of Canadians, and not only didn't the Prime Minister of Canada come out to speak to the protesters, like you would expect in a functioning democracy, shake some hands, ask some questions, provide some answers. All that the protesters received from the Prime Minister were insults that had absolutely no basis, that completely rejected the possibility that the protesters were out asking for something reasonable. In Spain, we're seeing massive protests today, and Spain has been experiencing massive protests since 2012. So for 10 years, the people of Spain are in the streets on regular occasions by the million, protesting against austerity, against the standard of living that is becoming unsustainable, against youth unemployment, against the lack of protests, against all sorts of neoliberal measures. Nobody cares. It doesn't matter which party comes to power. It was the Conservative Party. Nobody cared. Now Spain has, as a ruling party, socialists, ruling in coalition with communists, but the result is the same. Nobody cares about what the people want. We're seeing throughout these old established democracies, digital censorship that is increasing all the time. We see growing numbers of people who are afraid of expressing their views. And in that respect, for example, the Cato Institute recently published a survey where 62% of Americans say that they're afraid of sharing their political views. Now, 62% is a large majority. It is just not possible to have 62% of the population at the extreme of the political spectrum, right? 62%, these are not radical people. If 62% are radical, then radical has become the center. That's the only explanation we can give. Also, Cato Institute says that 52% of college students in America say that they always or often refrain from expressing their views in class. Just think about it, more than a half of students either always or often conceal what they really think. That is not okay. And before people think that I only quote right-wing sources on the subject, I'm going to quote a left-wing source. On March 18 this year, the New York Times published an op-ed titled "America Has a Free Speech Problem," and making the same observation as the Cato Institute, Americans are losing hold of a fundamental right as citizens of a free country, the right to speak their minds and voice their opinions in public without fear of being shamed and shunned. Now let's look at this quote from the New York Times more closely, because it uses some terminology and makes some assumptions that only function, they only work in a certain kind of society, in a certain kind of statehood, and in a certain form of government. So Americans are losing hold of a fundamental right as citizens of a free country. But what is a right? Who or what grants the right, and who or what guarantees it? We say that as Americans, we have our God-given rights, and that is great. But even though our rights might be God-given, we still need some sort of institutions to guarantee those rights. Otherwise, we can appeal to God, but if there's nobody and nothing to guarantee that we actually can enjoy those rights, those pleas are not going to be very meaningful. Now, what is a citizen? Is it a concept that is even meaningful anymore? What makes the concept of a citizen meaningful? Here, look at the quote. It says, a fundamental rights as citizens. So this presupposes that citizens are a meaningful category, and citizens are people who have rights. Now, there's another concept here that can have very different meanings, the concept of a country. What is a country? Apparently, the country that is being discussed here in this quote is the kind of a country that guarantees rights to citizens. This is actually not a given. Countries that guarantee rights to citizens are historically quite a new invention in historical terms. If countries that exist to guarantee rights to citizens were created historically recently, they have not existed always as a natural emanation of some sort of a natural law, then it stands to reason to assume that this type of a country, if it was created at some point in history, fairly recent, that type of country can also go away. Why do we believe that countries guarantee rights? Do countries always guarantee rights? Do countries have to guarantee rights? Is it possible for us to see soon enough countries that don't guarantee any rights at all, going back to a long-standing historical norm? What happens when a country is no longer a very meaningful concept? What happens if a country no longer has any power or desire to guarantee any rights or anything? Is that possible? So what is modern representative democracy? Can it exist without fundamental rights, without citizenship, without the concept of a country that guarantees fundamental rights to citizens? Is that going to be democracy? If all of these concepts, the rights, the citizenship, the country, what if they fade away? What if they lose meaning? Do we still have a modern representative democracy? Do we still have a meaningful democracy, or do we just have an empty term that no longer means anything? Now, I just said that the concept of a country that guarantees basic fundamental rights to citizens is a historically fairly recent invention. And when I say it's an invention, it doesn't mean it's bad. Some of the best things about human civilization are invented, artificial, and we still enjoy them a lot. Art is completely artificial. It's invented. It's a product of human artifice. It's the product of human striving and effort. That doesn't make art any less valuable. So the concept of a country as we understand it today, an entity with well-defined borders, with a national flag, a national anthem, with the concept of a citizenship, a constitution or a charter of rights is a basic form of a social contract between the government and the citizens, passports, customs office. That version of a country is historically very new. It was first invented in the 18th century and then put in practice in some parts of the world in the 19th century, and then in other parts of the world throughout the 20th century. Today, this new form of government, this new form of statehood, which is called the nation state, is the organizing principle of world politics. But again, historically, it's very new. It was created at the same time as capitalist economy was coming to the moment of its great flourishing, and nation state was very useful to capitalism because it organized people into a form of living that was very helpful to the development of capitalism. So from this marriage of the nation state as a form of governmentality and capitalism as a form of economic development, from their marriage, modern democracy, modern representative democracy was born. And together with all of the concepts of fundamental rights, citizenship as we understand it today, and all of the good things that arise from that, the welfare state, etc., individual rights. So this moment in history where capitalism really needed the nation state needed capitalism, and together they produced these forms of government, and such as different varieties of democracy and the idea of individual rights of the citizens. So this stage of capitalism that existed throughout the 19th century and until the 1970s is called the solid stage of capitalism. It's called solid because in that stage of its development, capitalism existed in the form of industries that were tied to the land. So factories, railroads. It was very important for the capitalists of the 19th century, the first half of the 20th century, to have a workforce that would show up to work every day, and that workforce should speak the same language, ideally to be able to communicate. It should be reasonably healthy. It should be at least minimally educated. It should be able to perform the same tasks and understand why it's important to do it. It's a labor force that stays rooted in a certain place and doesn't just wander off whenever it feels like. And who could provide all of that? Who could provide this kind of labor force? Well, the nation state that provided, for example, the free, comprehensive, basic education to everybody in the same language within the country, creating the sort of a cultural and linguistic uniformity that would make it easier for people to go to the factory together and work there together, and then live together in their town, in their city, in their village, enjoying their communal life together, not wanting to move away someplace else. So the nation state would guarantee this labor force to capital, and capital in turn would support the nation state because it all worked together. It was a very nice synergy between the two. Then little by little, by the decade of the 1970s, capital transformed because the world economy was transforming. The most productive part of the economy became the finance, the sphere of finance, because of the developments in technology, because of developments later in digitalization, automation. Capital was no longer interested in all that labor. Capital now could just get up and move wherever it wanted. You could move your factory wherever it was more convenient without much interest in what would happen to people who remained. And at this point, when capital no longer needed all of those workers, when capital no longer had any interest in the workers having access to at least some basic forms of welfare, such as free public education and basic health care. At that point, the nation state becomes unnecessary. It becomes unnecessary to capital. It is still necessary to the people, but who cares about that, right? Capital can just move wherever it wants, and the nation state model just loses its relevance. When the nation state model loses its relevance, it takes away, when it goes away, it takes away everything that it brought with it, the fundamental rights, the concept of the country that guarantees fundamental rights, the concept of citizenship. These concepts all arose at a certain time in history for a certain purpose. When that purpose is no longer there, those concepts also wither away. And we are with this with the same question that we had at the beginning. If the nation state is no longer relevant, who's supposed to guarantee all of these fundamental rights? We can get together and discuss for a very long time and publish articles in the New York Times or wherever that citizens have fundamental rights. But if nobody is interested in guaranteeing those fundamental rights, the soul remains at the level of talk and not much else. So after the nation state fades away, what is the new form of governmentality that is arising right now? Still, we're still in the process of this new form of government being created, this new form of society being created. So it doesn't have a specific name. We can refer to it as the post-nation state. And we can observe some of its characteristics already. The post-nation state has enormous economic inequality. Of course, inequality always existed. However, the nation state derived its legitimacy in the eyes of the citizens and the eyes of the people by the fact that it created large middle classes. The nation state needed to seek legitimacy from the citizens of the country. So as a result, the nation state was engaged actively in creating and maintaining large middle classes. In the post-nation state, the government no longer seeks legitimacy through the citizens. The citizen is not an interesting, meaningful concept anymore. So as a result, there are no efforts made to maintain the middle class in existence. To the contrary, there are efforts to erode the middle class, to make it smaller. And we're observing this in many different countries right now that used to have large, strong middle classes. Those middle classes are evaporating. And this is one of the central characteristics of this post-nation state. Many of the different phenomena that we're seeing, such as, for example, the cancel culture that was mentioned before, happened in response to the dramatic reduction of the middle class. So as those good white-collar jobs are disappearing, they're evaporating, people start fighting each other to the death for the remaining good white-collar jobs. So they start these wars of total annihilation and social media, attacking each other for some tiny little imaginary transgressions of an old tweet here or an ancient post over there, because this is part of trying to remain within the vanishing middle class and trying to eliminate the growing competition. More and more people are pushed out of productive life, and these are people who fall in the category, the exploding category of people suffering from extreme levels of drug addiction. These are the deaths of despair that are just wiping out large parts of population. These are people who are not, this is not the kind of a poverty that causes literal starvation. People are not starving physically, but they're starving emotionally and intellectually because there's no space for them in productive life anymore. The post-nation state only offers a very, very limited number of openings within productive life, and the sacrifices you have to make to get into those tiny little openings are very, very large. What people have to do to try to catch up a little bit with these very fast moving flows of finance is to try to imitate the breakneck speed of the movement of capital. We have to do this both physically by constantly being on the move, constantly moving wherever the opportunities are, but we also are expected to do this mentally, psychologically, intellectually. You constantly are expected to pivot. You constantly are expected to adapt the new normal, uh, find a new career, learn to code. You constantly have to try to catch up with the extremely fast-paced environment of financial flows. You have to turn yourself, so to speak, into a river that flows really fast and follows capital wherever it goes. This, of course, is very hard. This is hard for people. This comes with a lot of anxiety, fear, stress. Um, Human beings are not adapted by our nature to this kind of existence that is an existence of complete rootlessness, loneliness, and the constant need to catch up, the constant need to transform yourself into something new, into something more convenient and more useful to capital. So this is the post-nation state into which we're moving. It has many other characteristics, but I'm just putting here the most important ones. At this point in the post-nation state, all of these problems that we're seeing, there is no longer any feeling among people that the state or the government is going to try to soften the blow for the people in any sort of way. So this is a question we have to ask. Is it really democracy that people around the world are being disillusioned with? Or what is causing all of this discontent and unhappiness is actually this new form of government, the post-nation state, that has no mechanism to guarantee people's rights? Is it really democracy that people have a problem with? Or is it the post-nation state and nobody's asking them about that? People attribute their feelings of disaffection to democracy because they perceive democracy as not functioning. And the reason why democracy is not functioning is that it can only exist within a state form within which democracy has a meaning. And within post-nation state, it just does not have meaning because the fluid capital doesn't have much use for a vast labor force. And so all of these people that are no longer useful to capital, they are no longer useful to the post-nation state, they're on their own. Nobody's interested in protecting their rights because within this new state form, their rights just simply are not a meaningful, valid concept. And to close this discussion, I want to give an example of this struggle, this epic struggle between the nation state and the post-nation state that is occurring right now. It's difficult for me to talk about the symbolic aspect of the war of Russia against Ukraine because as a Ukrainian, I feel the tragedy of my country very, very deeply. But if we try to abstract ourselves from the daily suffering of what is happening in Ukraine, we can see very clearly that in Ukraine, there is this massive struggle happening between the nation state, which Ukrainians have been trying to build in the past 6-7 years, The real nation state with democracy, with industrialization, building factories, with the national anthem, the borders, the flag, everything. And we also have Russia that never managed to build a meaningful nation state. Russia is very large, it's the largest country on earth, enormous territory. It's a country that's extremely diverse, ethnically, racially, linguistically, culturally. It is not impossible to create a coherent nation state narrative for a country like that, but it would take an enormous amount of effort that in Russia was just not invested into the project of Russian nationhood. And so Russia moved directly into the post nation state, the open borders, the fluid existence, extreme inequality, no interest in democracy or individual rights. And so when Ukraine started building a real nation state right next door to Russia, of course, that created a lot of unhappiness and resentment in Russia with its post-nation state. And now we're seeing that this all expressed itself into a war of Russia against Ukraine. We are currently experiencing a lot of different effects of the creation of this new state form, which is post-nation state. It remains to be seen in what direction things develop. I hope very much that we can still look at what is happening and realize that this post-nation state model is not optimal, and in some way at least turn back towards the nation state and all of the good, wonderful things that it used to guarantee, such as individual rights, such as the concept of citizenship, and of course, such as representative democracy. Thank you so much, and I welcome any comments.